Final Fantasy XVI is the most recent mainline entry in the extremely popular RPG franchise, as I'm sure you all know if you clicked on this video. But it's also one of the most controversial. People's opinion on the game seem to be very, love or hate. Some adore it for its fun gameplay, amazing world and characters, while others dislike it for its messy story and deviation from the series' roots. And well, Final Fantasy XVI is very different than the older games. It's got character action gameplay, kinda like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, instead of the series' more traditional turn-based style. And it's a lot less focused on a large party of characters. According to most, FF16 is the darkest Final Fantasy game. I mean, come on, out of all the mainline games, it's the only one that's rated M, so it's gotta be true. And while that might have been accurate at one point in time, it's far from what we got with the end product. Psst! Everyone, come over here. It's story time. I'm a massive Capcom shill, so the combination of the news that the lead combat designer of DMC5 and Dragon's Dogma was working on this game, and the fact that it was going to be a medieval, dark fantasy action game, immediately had my attention. It was like a dream come true, and how strong that announcement trailer was definitely had a large part in getting me as hyped as I was. Seeing what looked to be a more grounded take on the same Final Fantasy concepts looked so compelling to me. The music and the dialogue was permanently seared into my mind. You all know the target. Shiva's dominant. And only the dominant. What do you mean you refuse? Did you not pledge your sword to our cause? All of that stuff was just permanently seared into my mind. The dialogue, the beating drums, chants of a choir. Eventually the song switches up to these angelic vocals, and it feels like it's the backing force of our protagonist as he swears revenge.
I'll kill you. If it's the last thing I do.
I remember jumping on any news of the game's development like a hawk, desperate for any drop of content about the game. I would spend hours reading articles or looking at early screenshots, envisioning this dream dark fantasy action game that I've wanted since a kid, and it seemed to finally be coming true. The hype was unreal, and for good reason. Fast forward to 2024, Final Fantasy XVI's second DLC has just come out, and while playing it, there was this moment that sent me back in time. It was the motif of a song. It only played for a couple of seconds, but I instantly recognized it. It was the song that played at the ending of the original announcement trailer. It completely flashed me back to when I was so excited for 16, and it made me understand why, even though I loved the game, like really loved it, it was a little bit disappointing to me. From articles and trailers alike, I was being told that 16 is the darkest Final Fantasy game. It looked gritty and down to earth, while still keeping the fantastical elements that the series was known and loved for. But that game only existed in trailer and article form. The actual game ended up just being another Final Fantasy. Not that that's bad at all. The game follows the same series tropes, and outside of the first third, I wouldn't really call it much darker than any other Final Fantasy. After finishing the DLC and my trip down memory lane, I was left with the question of, if it's not FF16, then what is the darkest Final Fantasy game? So I scoured the internet for what the darkest Final Fantasy games are, and the main three that kept popping up were Final Fantasy XVI, Final Fantasy Type 0, and Final Fantasy Tactics. So I thought it'd be fun to compare those three games based off their tone, content, and ending, to decide what truly is the darkest Final Fantasy. Plus, it gave me a reason to play Tactics and Type 0 for the first time, which I've been meaning to do for a while now. Ooh, and I'll also be giving a point to whichever the winner of each category is, just so we can find out which is truly the darkest Final Fantasy. Also, spoilers for each one of these games. It's not going to be a play-by-play of all the events or anything, but you've been warned. Okay, before we get started, let me clarify a little bit on what I mean by tone. To me, tone and vibe are pretty much interchangeable, so we'll be looking at the stuff that makes up the vibe of the game. The art, the music, all stuff that just helps capture the overall feel. With that in mind, let's jump into it. Okay, starting this off with FF16, the game very much does have a dark tone for the first third. But in that first act, the game is incredibly dark. The game's world, story, and characters all being very equally bleak. The art and the music only reinforcing that. This first act, which I won't shut up about, is when we follow Clive at his lowest point, but I'll get into that more in the content section. But because of this, it's also definitely when the game's at its most gloomy. Everything seems to be sad and sapped of life, and when you do get any color, it's likely blood being spilt from friend and foe alike. And if not blood, then fire, as you watch the world and all its inhabitants burn around you. I would say even in this first third, the game isn't trying to be doom and gloom all the time. We get a lot of breaks from the violence and even a funny scene here or there. Moving on to the music though, most of what you're going to be hearing from the game is big, brassy, oppressive symphonies, helping drown out the sound of battle. And when you're not in battle, you're probably hearing some melancholic banger, reminding you of what you lost, or maybe what you never had in the first place. Moving on to Final Fantasy Type 0, I'd say this game has one of the more unique feels compared to every other FF game. From the bad voice acting to the dark subject matter, yet how lightly everyone treats it. It feels like you're stuck in some kind of bad dream. And it stays that consistently weird for the whole game. I know it's kind of an insane comparison, but this game kind of reminds me of Silent Hill, with its dreary atmosphere and how at every turn there seems to be no escape from this perpetual dread. Also, the weird voice acting, at least in the English dub, definitely reinforced those opinions. The game has a very strange way of giving out its story, leaving you usually confused on what's going on. The characters all talk cryptically, constantly leaving you wondering if there is something you're unaware of or if the game is just poorly written. It's all very weird and sometimes even disturbing, but it doesn't go a whole lot further than that. I would say the game definitely is much more sad than it is dark and disturbing, and this is also definitely shown in the music as well. Most battle themes being big warlike anthems, but usually with depressing lead melodies reminding you of what you're fighting for, or maybe even the lack of said reason. And the more chill songs are usually very haunting, almost as some cruel reminder of what you've lost even though you can't remember it. The game's art only adds to its weird tone, colors usually being very washed out and contrast being really high. The game almost looks oversaturated, one color usually dominating whatever scene it's being shown in. I've only played Final Fantasy Type 0 HD, but from what I've seen of the original game on the PSP, it looked a whole lot better. Colors were more distinct, and it was before they remastered the look of Class 0. Everyone's got the weird freaky Mia face from Resident Evil 7, or even some cutscenes remind me of old Tekken CGI with how shitty and uncanny it looks. I hate these remasters that improve the art of the game, but really just destroy the art style of the original. It's so stupid, and this trend needs to come to an end. Or if they were gonna do this change of look, they should have actually committed. Whenever you see any characters using their old PSP model versus one of the new models, the contrast is insane and it just takes me so far out of it. It's so yucky, I hate it so much. But yeah, the game's high contrast and washed out look gives the world an almost sickly feel to it. Also, all the important cutscenes in the game are framed like a war documentary. There's a bunch of film grain and damage all over the footage, while also dates and times are stamped. I like to think someone could show their dementia-ridden grandparents this game and convince them that it was covering a war that actually happened.
Oh yes, I remember. All I could see is the damage from all the magic, and all I could smell was gunpowder. I remember when we had to gun down all those dragons. Those dragons never stopped.
Okay, but that was about all I had to say about Final Fantasy Type 0. On to the next. FFT's tone is easily the least depressing out of the three, but that doesn't mean it's any less dark, necessarily. It's also harder to compare tactics to Type 0 and 16 because of it being an RPG from the 90s. A lot of different technical limitations come with that, wherein 16 and Type 0 are both action RPGs from the 2010s, 2020s. That's not to say the technical limitations make it any less of a good game, though. I would say the game actually uses it to its advantage, framing the game like a play, you, the player, being part of the audience. You're limited to only seeing sets and bits of character interaction, what the showrunners want you to see. It can be a little bit jarring coming off from more modern games, but it's definitely a very effective way of storytelling. There's obviously more of a world out there that you're not seeing, but it's left up to the imagination, only being led by a couple pieces of art or some key dialogue. Differences aside, this game is actually surprisingly cozy. The character art is actually really cute, and you go from town to town stopping by at a local bar to pick up on rumors, or maybe just to try to find a gig to make some quick cash. Or you go grocery shopping to one of the little wares shops, stocking up on items or new equipment, customizing your build for hours on end. It's all strangely cozy for the subject matter of the game, there being this massive war going on in Ivalence? Is that how you say it? Ivalence. Whatever. Outside of the story battles, the music is usually really cute and upbeat, but even when you are in the thick of it and some big emotional plot is happening, the music never becomes as intense or depressing as anything from Type 0 or 16. Battle themes acting more as the backbone instead of the driving force of whatever scene it's being played in. And same can be said about the chill music, just something nice to have in the background as you spend hours in menus. It's not just the character art of the game that's cute, but just the art style in general. The game uses usually really warm hues, adding to how adorable and well-drawn the pixel art is. That's not to say there's nothing dark about this game stylistically, though. The eventual contrast between the content of the game and the art can lead to some really disturbing moments. Kinda like the same feeling you'd get watching a banned episode of your favorite childhood cartoon. But all things considered, tone-wise, I would definitely say it's the least dark out of the three. And between 16 and Type 0, I'd have to give it to Type 0 because of its overall unnerving feel of doom and gloom, while also being able to stick with that tone consistently throughout the whole game, not sacrificing it for a narrative shift. Not that there was anything wrong with that. And while 16's tone is very dark and gloomy, it doesn't stay that way consistently enough for me to want to give this point to 16 over Type 0. Okay, moving on to the meat of this discussion, the narrative and gameplay content of the games. Final Fantasy XVI is an action RPG with emphasis on the action, where you go from fighting grunts on the battlefield to kaiju battles on an immense scale. The presentation may be different, but none of this is really out of the ordinary for this franchise. The gameplay at its most intense is probably during one of those aforementioned kaiju fights, or as the game calls them, icon battles. These big intense fights were a major selling point for the game and all the marketing, plus they gotta live up to the expectation of being a playable summon animation from previous games, so I'm sure whatever is in them has to be good.
Fucking make it happen! Don't want to hear any goddamn excuses.
And, this is not the right footage. It's icon with an E, not with an I. In one of these icon battles, your summons receive battle damage, and you might see one lose an... Oh my god, that is still not the right footage. Damn it. There we go. Okay. What was I saying? Yeah. In one of these icon battles, one of your summons might get a chunk blown out of them or lose a limb. But I think that's about as graphic as this game ever gets in one of these fights. And in regular combat, other than blood effects and the like, there's not a whole lot of really dark content within the gameplay. Some cool takedown animations, nothing really all too gory or violent though. But that's kinda true about most of these games. Most of the darkest content comes from out of gameplay, not during. In cutscenes we see decapitations, accidental patricide, almost child murder, whatever was going on in this scene, oh my god, group executions, etc. Just about every violent, disturbing thing that could happen in a dark fantasy context happens in this game. And narratively, we follow Clive Rosfield, who's in over his head for most of this story. He's fighting an uphill battle, and because of this his hands get dirty. Really dirty. You see a lot of the horrors of war in this game, and what it's like to live with no healthcare or modern medicine. But alongside these struggles of medieval life, the game also presents to us fantasy racism.
Another fucking branded.
In this medieval fantasy world of Valistea, some people are born with the ability to use magic, and others aren't, which usually leads to these bearers of this magical ability being heavily discriminated against and oppressed. And our main man Clive is one of those said bearers. The whole plot of the game is that Clive and his gang are trying to end this systematic oppression, and whenever we're shown how this system affects the land and its people is usually whenever it's at its darkest. We are shown bearers, people like everyone else, being treated as slaves of war, doing the dirty work that nobles and even regular soldiers are too above. We see them be slaughtered for simply being the way they were born. We also see how this systematic oppression has warped people's minds, how mothers will abandon their child and treat them as trash just for being born with the ability to use magic, and how kids are raised to not view bearers as human, but as more of a useful tool or a plaything to be tossed aside if it ever outruns its usefulness. For the first third of the game, we see how Clive deals with this messed up land and how it forms his opinion on his place in the world. Once his ideals are fully built up, which is everything past the 1/3 mark, the game stops showing us these events that shape him and focuses more on his new mentality. Because of that, we see less of the world's cruelty moving forward, and the game focuses more on telling its fun, action-packed journey. Another thing we see a lot of before the game's narrative switch is Clive's sadness. We see how his childhood scarred him, and we see how toxic his mindset has been while he was a slave fighting endlessly. We see all of this boil up and eventually explode when it's revealed that he was the one who killed his brother. After 13 years of his only motive for living being revenge, it was himself who he was after this whole time. The game shows us the self-hate, anger, and sadness that all comes from this, and it's all handled in a very serious way. This depressive tone follows Clive throughout most of the early parts of the game, and that never-ending sadness really does make this game a lot darker. And sure, we do get sad stuff later in the game, like the context behind Jill and Dion's story, but none of that really compares to how depressing the earlier parts of the game are. Moving on over to Type 0 now. I'll just spoil it right here and right now. I don't think Type 0's story ever gets as dark as 16's. The gameplay though. The game focuses on this elite class of child soldiers, forced to fight a war they don't understand. The gameplay is mega jank, it being a PS Vita action RPG. Battle to battle, especially early game, is an absolute slog. The lock-on being your biggest enemy, making the floaty, unresponsive controls even more unbearable. And you have to grind so much if you don't want it to be a nightmare to play. I swear, after playing the game for more than an hour, the grass would start looking greener, and I'd start remembering plans I could make. Just everything started to seem way more appealing than playing the game. So not to sound like an absolute psycho, but I do think how unappealing and frustrating the core gameplay is really helps solidify this game's gritty feel. This game doesn't really have a set protagonist, it more so focusing around 15 main characters. Class 0. You follow the class in this war on a ground level. You fight these fights and you see the pain and suffering that comes with. The gameplay grounds you in the world and the story that's being told. Just like 16, it's depressing as hell. To elaborate on what I said earlier, Class 0 is the beacon of hope and the prime influence to all the other child soldiers serving at this war academy. In this dark, twisted, and cruel world, people who die are completely wiped from everyone's memory. So, not only are you child soldiers being manipulated into fighting a war, you are highly, highly disposable child soldiers being manipulated into fighting this war. It's kind of genius in a way though. You, the player, seeing all this death and destruction, but the characters not being able to remember it. It's so fucked up, and handled in a very interesting way. The game doesn't really branch out a whole lot more than I've already said, and for it being the first M-rated Final Fantasy game, it doesn't really use that rating a whole lot, other than having more blood than other Final Fantasy games from this era. The game knows what it wants to do, and it does it really well. Gameplay be damned. Also, apparently there's some way to make the gameplay fun by using summons all the time, but I never did that. Okay, moving on to Final Fantasy Tactics. The contents of this game are dark as hell. FFT is a tactical RPG set in the world of Ivalence, following Ramza caked up Bellevue, or Belov, however you say his name. Bayolf? Bolv? I don't know, I know it's wrong, I always say Bellevue though. However you say it, doesn't really matter. But the game came out in 1997, and we follow Ramza's coming of age and his eventual quest to better the world. The game masterfully uses its technical limitations to frame the game as a play, as I already said earlier. The way things are framed and how characters act is all very Shakespearean in nature. Ramza being born royalty, he sees how the world treats the lower class, but he chooses to ignore it, feeling that his duty is more important. We see the cruelty and prejudice that royals have, their absolute lack of care of human life. Anyone who isn't royalty is just pawns to the people in power. This is mainly shown to us via Ramza's best friend, Delita, and we see how respect is fake to him only because he's friends with royalty. This double-sided way his friend is being treated, and how obvious it hurts him, motivates both of the characters for the whole story. And this is eventually all brought to a boiling point when Delita's sister is used and thrown away without a second thought. Someone completely unrelated from this conflict being used as a tool of war. This helping Ramza understand that the way things are right now, royals are only doing more harm than help. Because of this political corruption and cruelty, we also get a lot of murder and betrayal in Tactics. And I would argue it's depicted in a darker way than any of the other Final Fantasies, because of the more personal level we're seeing this all on. We see characters get stabbed, shot, exploded, stabbed some more, sliced, stabbed even more. You would think Yoko Taro directed this game with the amount of stabbings there are in it. Your morals and what's right and wrong is always being pushed to the max, and it's all handled in a very mature way, sometimes even disturbing. Oh, and if you hadn't guessed by now from me not bringing it up yet, there's really nothing all too dark in the gameplay. There are some violent spells, some scary monsters. Really nothing I would call dark though. So out of these three, I'm gonna have to give this point to 16 because of its heavy, hard-hitting story and for the amount of graphic content they're willing to show off from this world, even if it is mainly only in the beginning of the game. I know I never shut up about this game's tonal switch, but I do think the content shown up to that point, and even the stuff after, is dark enough for me to want to give this point to 16 over the other two games, despite their depressing stories and heavy themes. 16's already got most of that stuff, and more. Okay, on to the deciding factor of which of these three are the darkest Final Fantasy game. The ending. I know I already gave a spoiler warning earlier, but this extra goes for this category. All of these games have amazing, shocking endings, and they'd all be worth experiencing on your own. If you already played or just really don't care, let's get into it. Once again, starting with Final Fantasy 16. For a while now, Clive has been reunited with his brother Joshua, who he thought he killed, but he didn't actually for some reason that isn't really explained that well. But he's also been in a sexy relationship with Jill. His quest to destroy the crystals so there isn't any more magic and everyone will be equal is almost complete, and the only thing standing in his way is this old god Ultima. Before the ensuing final battle, Clive says his farewells to Jill and the others, promising that he'll be fine and return in the morning. After saying their farewells, Clive, Joshua, and Dion all set out for this final fight. In the ensuing battle, Clive and Joshua are heavily injured right away, and Dion falls during the fight, in a strangely anticlimactic end to his character. When trying to recover, the two run into Ultima, and he ends up killing Joshua, for real this time, in a really strange scene that's still able to work because of Ben Starr's killer performance as Clive.
Joshua!
Clive's only reason to live when he was younger was to protect Joshua, and he's been filled with so much hate and sadness because not only did he fail to save him, he was also the one responsible for his demise. But Joshua didn't die, at least not back then. Him still being alive gave Clive another chance at redemption, and a true reason to live again. But now, once again, he's failing to protect his brother, losing his reason for life. But things are different. He has someone waiting for him to come home. He still has purpose. But for redemption, at least in his own eyes, I don't think it's any longer a possibility. It's all such genius character writing. Unfortunately, the way the scene is framed though, and the pacing of the dialogue, it kinda comes off as awkward to me. But that's not the point. I'm not reviewing Final Fantasy XVI. I'm discussing if it's the darkest Final Fantasy or not. So, after all that, Clive and Ultima's fight begins in proper. After multiple phases, a couple of cheesy, but cool nonetheless power of friendship moments, and a series name drop for some reason, Ultima is defeated, and Clive is able to muster up the rest of his strength to complete his quest and destroy magic once and for all. Clive wakes up, stranded on a beach, completely powerless, on the brink of death. Attempting to use magic, he sees that he was successful, but he also sees the toll all this has taken on his body. Cut to Jill, who is at the hideaway. One of the characters who was pregnant just gave birth, and everyone there is excited for a kid to be able to grow up in this new world, hopefully free of all this long-standing prejudice. Jill sees the wishing star right next to the moon, Medea, fade away, and sensing that something's wrong, begins to cry, assuming Clive has died. She leaves the room to continue to sob, with Torgal by her side, happy that their dream has come true, but heartbroken by the loss of her love, her reason to live. As she cries, the dawn of a new day begins, and Jill stops crying and starts to look a little bit happier. And that's it. Roll credits. Obviously, a quick recap can't do it justice, but it's masterful stuff. The tragedy of these characters intertwined with the hope of a better tomorrow is so effective. And why did Jill stop crying at the end? Was she just thinking Clive would want her to be happy in this new world? Or did Clive somehow survive his injuries and return like he said he would? No matter which interpretation you believe, there is no canon answer, and that fact makes this ending so bittersweet. There's also a post-credit scene, but I don't think it adds much, at least to this conversation, so I'm just gonna ignore that. Okay, moving on to Type 0. So, Class 0 inadvertently started the apocalypse. But on the bright side, they're really good at making lemonade out of lemons. So, even though Guardian Angel Teacher Mommy isn't there to revive them, and they all know that because of this, if they die, all memory of them will be completely erased, so their whole existences would have truly been for nothing, they still set out to defeat the god behind all this. After a brutal test of skill and will, and some other stuff between Rem and Machina, and also some really scary UI for some reason, but once again, I don't think any of that stuff is really relevant for this conversation, so I'm just not gonna bring it up any further. The gang get to this twisted god, the Arbiter. The fight that ensues is actually really cool. Each member gets stricken down one after another, but because of their work together, they're able to put down this beast. Bloodied and bruised after their fight, uncertain of their future, using the power of their will or some other anime stuff like that, they show the god watching over them that they want the crystals gone. The crystals being the main thing people are fighting over in this world. And they were also the thing that erased people's memories of the dead, to supposedly spare you of the grief. The crystals is also why the apocalypse started, so supposedly if we're able to get rid of those, then, things will go back to normal. After all that, back in the class, the closest any of them had to an actual home, they understand that they don't have much time to live after how bad they all got messed up in that fight. They all react to this in different ways. Some are afraid of what's to come after they die, others not ready, still wanting to do more in life. But what really sets them all off is when Sync, who's mostly been a beacon of hope and a comedic relief throughout the game, completely breaks down in tears. The gang all huddle together and try to comfort her. This act being what brings them together is so genius, but so heartbreaking to me. They know death is coming for them, and none of them want to die. To lighten the mood, they all start to think of their futures and what they would do now that the war's over and they have actual free will for the first time. After that, they think even further ahead, reflect on goals and aspirations. None of them have had the luxury to truly act on their own before this, and that decision to all gather around and try to comfort that annoying comedic relief girl, their first act being one of love, is what brought them together, on a level unknown to them before. They know they won't live 10 years into the future, but just hearing people talk about it provides them with all a sense of comfort like no other. No longer thinking about their fears, they all spend their last moments together, huddled, laughing, no longer afraid of what's to come. Then the credits roll as you sit there with tears in your eye, But don't get too comfortable yet, because the game isn't done with you. About halfway through the credits, we get one more scene. We see those two characters who I said weren't that important earlier, Machina and Rem. They bust into the classroom, hoping to find the rest of their classmen there. And they sure do find them all right. In the rubble of their class, around their banner, all of Class 0 holding hands, dead. Being shocked and completely overcome by what they're seeing, Machina and Rem rush over, bursting into tears, trying to see if they can do something, anything, to bring them back. This is the first time they've been able to recognize the dead. What they're feeling must have been unimaginable. After a while, Machina pulls himself off the floor and looks out over the horizon, Rem by his side. They both take in this new world that they helped make. After that, we get a few blocks of text describing how the world got worse before it got better. Like, come on, couldn't you have saved that for like a little bit later? I don't need another gut punch like that right now. But get better it eventually did, because of the help of Rem and Machina, who carry the rest of Class 0 and their dreams with them. Wow. What am I even to say? This ending is so violently sad. The love Class 0 has for each other, juxtaposed by the situation they're in, is jaw-dropping. They go through all that turmoil and strife for a better future they'll never get to see, but at least they're able to have a proper death in this new world. And even if it's not by many, they will be remembered. Mwah! Chef's kiss. It's so good! But moving on to tactics. Thankfully, we're not reviewing these games on which has the best ending. If we were, Tactics would have some really big shoes to fill. Okay, a while back now, Ramza's sister, Alma, got kidnapped, and the main thing we've been doing in the plot for a good bit now is just trying to track her down and get her back. And Ramza has finally been able to track her down, but Alma just got brought into the spooky evil dimension. The super duper evil dimension. Because apparently she's the perfect vessel for Ultima, who is the leader of all these monsters, who shares no connection to the Ultima in Final Fantasy 16, other than them both being cheeked up for some reason. And come on, I've been trying to ignore it for a while now, but why did they make Ramza so cheeked up for no reason? Like, damn, oh my god. But back to Ultima. Before that whole Dark Resurrection thing happens, the possessed body of Ramza's only cool older brother is forced to fight him, and it's actually really disturbing. But once that's over with, oh no, Ultima just got summoned. But Alma is okay for some reason, because they just defused once Ultima got summoned in her body. It's weird, and I don't really care. But we gotta stop this resurrected evil god to save the world. Once Ultima is defeated, in quite a hard fight to be fair, Ramza and Alma are thankfully reunited, but seemingly stranded in this evil dimension. Cut to a couple of weeks later and we see the few allies Ramza had gathered around a grave for him and Alma. They all say their closing thoughts and pay their respects, grateful to this unsung hero and his sacrifice to save the world, but remorseful that he'll be forgotten to time. And those who do remember him will probably have viewed him as a heretic and not as the hero that he was. Once everyone leaves, one of Ramza's closest allies, Orin, arrives at the grave to pay his respects, but he can't bring himself to believe that Ramza is truly dead. This world is cruel and unjust, but not barren of hope. Orin soon after, seeing what looks like Ramza and Alma ride by on Chocobo, his hope is returned, and he decides that he'll record the truth of this war, so the world can learn from it and hopefully become better. It's revealed to us after this scene that the church, sensing danger if their wrongdoings were outed, confiscated Orin's writing and burned him at the stake. But thankfully, generations later, one of Orin's descendants find these papers. Credits roll, and after that we get a scene with, King Delita and Queen Olivia. Delita, who was once Ramza's best friend, has been able to climb his way up the political ladder, so obsessed over the idea that if he could be in power, he could make the guilty repent for what they've done and make the world just. And here he is, finally at his end destination. But this new life he has built is just as unjust as the lives of those he sought to make repent. Most fear him because of his ruthless action and his unloyalty to everyone. He's seemingly soulless. Olivia is scared of this man she once loved, unsure if what they had was ever genuine or if she was just another one of the many people he used to get power. Overcome with these emotions, when Delita went to comfort her, sensing something is wrong, Olivia stabs him. Delita quickly after stabs her in retaliation. Then, bleeding out, Delita walks over and looks out at the horizon, wondering what the reward Ramza has for walking the path he did, and then collapses. Dead. I have mixed opinions on this ending, but I can't deny it's really effective. I think the lead up to the whole evil dimension thing is rushed and kinda stupid, and I wish Ultima stuff was elaborated on earlier in the game. Also feels kinda not out of left field, but just underdeveloped. This ending is also a lot harder of a pill to swallow because of how it's so negative, not bittersweet like the other ones. Sure, Ramza got to live and finally got reunited with Alma, but he didn't really succeed at his long-running goal. He didn't complete his task but die in the process like the other two, instead not completing his objective but getting to leave with his life and his loved ones. But at least his legacy got carried on with Orin, right? Until that got ended prematurely as well. Also, just the fact that Orin got killed off-screen in a block of text after a scene feels super weird to me. And sure, it's implied that things get better way in the future with Orin's descendant, but we never see that, and we never know if he would continue to try to carry on the legacy of these two. It's a massive downer of an ending, though I do love how realistically brutal it is. And I love that final shocking scene. Delita's selfishness in stabbing Olivia back and not just dying for her. Almost showing that she was right about him and that there was no love in that relationship. Delita was just using her like everyone else. But then in Delita's final line, we see him be genuine for the first time since the beginning of the game. Since before his sister died. He seems to regret his actions, especially towards Ramza. But we also see that he hasn't truly changed at all, still being that same tragic, jealous little kid he was all those years ago. So yeah, we got some tough competition in this category, but to me, the winner's pretty obvious, and it has to be Final Fantasy Tactics. Its brutal realism and depressing character conclusions make it stand out from the others in a series with a bunch of dark, bittersweet endings. And sure, 16 has its brutal character story conclusions, and Tactics with its depressing, emotional gut punch of an ending, both of these making really good competition. But since we're looking at these endings on which is the darkest, the no punches pulled tragedy of Tactics just takes the cake. But wait, the arbitrary numbers! How are we gonna figure out which of these three is the darkest Final Fantasy now? Okay, I know it sounds cheesy, but honestly, I do think that the real darkest Final Fantasy was the friends we made along the way. Hold up. In all seriousness though, I don't think there is one objective darkest Final Fantasy game. This series has been growing and changing for over 30 years now, and it's never pulled its punches. And because of that, I kinda think every Final Fantasy is the darkest Final Fantasy. They all have sad, tragic, and disturbing moments, but that's because everything in life does. So, for as long as this series keeps trying new things and innovating, telling new stories, being different, I think each entry in their own regard is the darkest Final Fantasy. And I'm assuming you might be asking, well, if they're all the darkest Final Fantasy games, why are their age ratings different? And to that, I say it's because the change in graphics and details in video games over time. Back in the 90s, you could have graphic content, blood, and swearing in your game and get away with a T rating because of the lack in detail in which it was all being presented. Let's compare Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy Tactics. Stay with me here, I swear this won't take long. Both of these games have a lot of the same content in them. They've both got blood, murder, war, big scary monsters, language, and really dark themes and subject matter. Except 16 gets the higher age rating because you're seeing all that shit in like 4K 60 FPS, high definition. I'm sure if you really wanted to, you could meticulously go through every Final Fantasy game, looking at every element, and decide which is the darkest Final Fantasy that way. But to me, as long as this series continues to be Final Fantasy, I would say each entry in their own regard gets to hold the title of the darkest Final Fantasy game. Hey, thank you all so much for watching the video, especially for making it to the end. I know it probably wasn't easy getting here. I'd like to give a quick shout out to Section Plays, ElAnalistaDeBits, Gamer's Little Playground, Gaming Bolt, Third Rate Gamer, Slashing Shadow, and Mr. Newbie. I used footage from each one of those channels for this video. My PS3 broke before I could record footage, so I couldn't get any footage from Tactics, and then it kind of shot my motivation to get any other footage. So most of the footage in the video isn't my own. I'm saying footage a lot. There's some Final Fantasy 16 PC footage in this. That was mine. So hopefully you enjoyed that. There's also some leftover Final Fantasy Type 0 clips that were mine from when I made that AMV a little bit back. But most of the footage wasn't my own, so big thanks to all those people. If you enjoyed the video and you want to see more, please like, subscribe, share the video with friends, you know, all the stuff. But just thanks again. I don't have any really set plans for what I'm gonna do next, but you can expect something eventually. I kind of want to do another AMV. I don't know if that's gonna get priority over another video though. We'll see. Videos kind of similar to this are my main thing that I'm gonna be doing, not AMVs. So if you're looking for AMVs, I'm sorry, but there'll probably be a couple more. But yeah, that was about it. Thank you.